Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
High stakes as Uncle Sam's days of impunity are finally over. Russia and China are determined to hold the American perpetrators of the Nord Stream sabotage to account. Uncle Sam's days, indeed decades, of wanton criminality are over. There's going to be hell to pay as the imperialist tyranny in Washington hits a wall of reality. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So several weeks have gone by with the U.S. and its Western lackeys stonewalling at the UN, squirming and resisting calls from Moscow and Beijing for an international criminal investigation into the sabotage of the Baltic Sea pipelines that were blown up in September. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne, because China and Russia on this issue, they don't seem to be going quietly into that long, dark night.
Well, this may be a reflection of what we've been talking about for some time now. That is to say, a shift in the global correlation of forces tilting against the North Atlantic powers and the cowboy regime in Washington, D.C. You may have received a glimpse of this in a recent decision by the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which ruled in favor of Iranian interests against those of the United States of America. It's quite extraordinary, but I think that too may reflect that the balance is tilting against those who had heretofore been riding high in the saddle. And I must say, it's going to take some getting used to, not only by Washington, but by observers as well, because certainly since 1945, this trend that I'm outlining right now has not hardly been dominant. And you also see it with regard to those who have been planning to visit China. Now, President Lula of Brazil was scheduled to visit the People's Republic, but he came down with pneumonia. He was supposed to spend 5 days there. But I dare say that will not hamper unduly Brasilia-Beijing relations. And we also know that within days, President Macron of France will be jetting off to China. It's hard not to stifle a giggle when he says that his purpose is to save China from the clutches of the evil empire, meaning Moscow. We all know that he's trying to escape the turmoil that he's unleashed in France with regard to his wrong-headed retirement plans for French workers. There has been rather startling speculation in the Financial Times of London that Mr. Macron might be out the door sooner rather than later. Not only out the door, but that France might be on the verge of having the Sixth Republic. That is to say, a total reworking of the political architecture in that powerful European Union country. I also have paid attention to the hawkish remarks of Ursula von der Leyen, sometimes referred to as Ursula von der Crazy, the leader of the European Commission, a leading EU body. She is wondering whether China wants to replace the United States and the EU as the sun in today's political galaxy. But someone should tell Madame von der Leyen that if that happens, it'll be the result, not necessarily because of the intentions of China, but more so because of the objective workings of the international system, not to mention the fumbles and stumbles by the EU and the United States. And of course, Charles Michel, another EU official, is headed to Beijing. Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain is headed to Beijing. And obviously, this puts a crimp and a cramp in the diabolical plans of U.S. imperialism to launch a new Cold War against the People's Republic. Recall that as we speak, either winging her way to the United States or here right now is the so-called president of Taiwan, the rebel island off the coast of China that China claims as its own, speaking of Tsai Ing-wen. And she is slated to meet with Speaker McCarthy. Beijing promises retaliation. It's not clear what dimensions that may take. But simultaneously, as we speak, the leader of the opposition in Taiwan, the KMT, which has ruled that island of 21 million many more years since 1949 with the Chinese Revolution than the current party is ruling. And that raises a tantalizing possibility that with Taiwanese elections in early 2024, you could not only have the current regime ousted, but you could have the coming to power of the KMT, the opposition, whose leader, as noted, is spending quality time in Beijing right now. And all of those arms that have gone to Taiwan from Washington stockpiles could effectively come under the aegis of Beijing. It would be a startling blow to the pretensions of U.S. imperialism. And at the same time, like a heartsick teenager, Mr. Biden is sitting by the phone, waiting to either place a call to President Xi or receive a call from him. President Xi is ducking his phone calls, refuses to return his phone calls. And I think President Xi has said, you know what, we're not going for that usual game, that two-fisted game that Washington plays, whereby on the one hand, they pat you in the back, and with the other hand, they try to pick your pocket. That is to say, with one hand, they reach out for a handshake, and the other hand, they go into their breast pocket and come out with a dagger to try to stab you. And so things are not looking very promising right now for U.S. imperialism. The question that we need to pose is what impact will this shifting correlation of forces have not only on the international community, but on the beleaguered working class and poor of the United States of America itself.
You know, another thing that is kind of implied by this very interesting article is that because the U.S. is losing the level of domination it has, that it will be more likely that there will be some level of accountability for the attack on Nord Stream. I've heard it referred to as the Nord Stream attack as a bomb with a long fuse. I think of it more as an infection. You know, I see, I believe the gentleman here refers to it as an infection. I like that better because it's there. Everyone knows it's there. It's ugly and you're watching it slowly grow. You don't know how far it is, but I don't feel as though this thing is so significant. And when you see what's happening in France, you have to feel that at some point the instability grows in Germany. And when that instability grows, you feel like that the peoples there know what happened, and that's going to be a part of their anger and frustrations, particularly as their economic situation grows more dire. Dr. Horne.
And we should put emphasis and stress on that latter point, because with the diminishing of cheap energy from Russia, which is the outcome of the bombing of this pipeline, it has been quite harmful to the German economy. In fact, I don't think you can separate the harm to the German economy from what's happening to Deutsche Bank, the leading enterprise of Germany, which, as you know, has very curious relationships to the 45th U.S. president, which are worthy of scrutiny and inspection. But with the turmoil in Deutsche Bank, which is spreading like a fungus throughout Europe, recall what's happened in neighboring Switzerland with the collapse of Credit Suisse. The ultimate trigger might have been the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in Northern California, which, as you know, has helped to finance high tech. And so with the collapsing of the banking system in the North Atlantic countries, this is bound to have devastating knock-on effects, not least in the locomotive of the European Union, speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany. And I think that this will help to cause many German progressives, unions, civil society, etc., to take a hard look at how Germany got into this perilous position, which perforce means taking a hard look at the Seymour Hersh article, the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, and what might be the ultimate irony is that as the United States and its allies supposedly are pursuing the president of Russia through means of the courts, it's Mr. Biden who may have an adjoining cell to Mr. Trump with regard to his misdeeds in terms of authorizing this criminal act.
Maybe they'll be cellmates instead of being adjoining cells. Maybe they'll be roomies. Sputnik International reports Burkina Faso set to resume diplomatic ties with the DPRK. They plan to resume diplomatic relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The nation's foreign minister, Oliver Rumamba, has announced. This is an interesting development, Dr. Horne.
It certainly is, and we should not fall asleep on what's been happening in Northeast Asia, particularly the more striking messages that we receive from the leadership. They are quite concerned about the rearming of Japan, which has been ignited by this anti-China hysteria. I should also mention that you cannot separate the recent trip of Vice President Harris to neighboring Ghana, the southern neighbor of Burkina Faso. You cannot separate that journey from these moves that are taken in Ouagadougou, the capital, aiming at restoring or beginning relations with those who heretofore had been considered part of the so-called axis of evil. This further sheds light upon all of the harried scurrying to the ancestral homeland, speaking of Africa, by also many U.S. officials, including Vice President Harris, because I think that Africa, which, to put it mildly, has had a star-crossed relationship with the North Atlantic countries, is in an advantageous position to sense not only the hypocrisy of this erstwhile powerful bloc, but the malevolence and the evil of these capitals, speaking of Washington, Paris, London, Berlin.
Brazil, China sign agreement to trade in yuan. We've talked about that before, but there's more. You know, France is has started buying in yuan, and Xiomara Castro from Honduras. You know, one day she says, "Hey, I'm not recognizing Taiwan anymore," and next day she's flying to China, supposedly to sign some economic agreements. I suspect the two are connected, Dr. Horne.
Well, certainly there's quite a bit of hysteria with regard to Chinese incursions in this hemisphere, what Washington considers to be its backyard. For example, in recent days, I've seen historical articles about Chinese interests building the North-South Highway in Jamaica, the homeland of so many Black people in the United States, including, by the way, Vice President Harris herself. You see historical articles about Chinese interests in Bahamas, just off the southern tip of Florida. Let's not even talk about the relationship between Cuba and China, close as lips and teeth. We mentioned the postponed trip to China of President Lula of Brazil. The leader of Colombia, President Petro, is headed to China within days, weeks, or months. And so, once again, we recall that it was the first President Bush who decades ago said that with regard to his country, the United States of America, that it had more will than wallet. Well, decades later, you see that financially and economically, the United States is not able to compete with Beijing. It still feels that it has the military advantage. But as we know, given their abject failures in Afghanistan and Iraq and other countries too numerous to mention on the military front, Washington would be ill-advised to try to pursue that particular option in terms of confronting the People's Republic of China.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate that analysis. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.